Good afternoon and a warm welcome to another event of The Author's Voice, an online lecture program jointly convened by the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and Gorgias Press. For those who don't know me, I'm Sabine Schmidtke, the permanent faculty at the School of Historical Studies representing Near Eastern Studies. And co-hosting today's event with me is Maria Mercedes Tuya, representing digital scholarship at the IAS, and George Kiras, editor-in-chief of Gorgias Press. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Christopher Clohessy. Christopher is a South African Catholic priest who holds a BST from the Pontifical University in Rome and a PhD from the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, also in Rome. Two of his recent Gorgias Press publications, Fatima, Daughter of Muhammad and Half of My Heart, led to his being named the Distinguished Scholar of Shi'i Studies in the Islamic Republic of Iran's 28th Book Award, World Book Awards in 2020. Chris is at present a resident faculty member of PISAI, lecturing there in Shi'i Islamic Studies, Quran and Islamic Ethics, and is visiting lecturer at the Pontifical Beda College in Rome, where he lectures in fundamental theology, ecclesiology, and Mariology. His latest book, Angels Hastening, the Karbalāঃ Dreams, was published by Gorgias Press in November 2021, and today's talk will focus on this book. Now, before I pass the word to Chris, a few words on the etiquette and also for the Q&A. So while Chris will be talking, we would be grateful if you could put any of your questions and comments in the chat. And once he's done, I will read them out and Chris will answer them. We are probably too many people to raise hands for you to speak out, but let's see. So I think the chat thing is much better. And now, without further ado, Chris, the floor is yours. Very much looking forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin simply by putting up a screen which describes something of the book in terms of its beginnings and its title. This book, the title of this book is taken from a Quranic verse. It's probably not terribly well translated by our friend Muhammad Marmaduke Pictol, but nonetheless, it's a pleasant enough translation. So the translation comes from verse 79, in which he speaks, or the Quran speaks, of angels hastening. And that was the title that I took for this book for reasons that I hope I will be able to make clear later on. And I want to begin perhaps with one single quote from the book, one of the texts that I translated, in fact, this text from Ibn ʿAsākir and his history, and it gives an idea of the sort of text that this book is dealing with. And the most important parts I've underlined because they are of interest. So Ibn ʿAsākir speaks of the angel of the rain, not of Jibreel, but the angel of the rain getting permission to come and visit the Prophet Muhammad. And permission is given him, and it is, the text says, the day of Salama, that is the day at which the Prophet is in the house of this particular wife. And she is given the instruction to stand guard over the door for us. The us refers to the Prophet and the angel who is now visiting him and who is engaging in a secret conversation with him so that no one could enter in upon us. But while she is attempting to guard the door, al-Ḥusayn bin Ali, who would have been a very small child, comes and darts between her legs because she is too old to stop him, not fast enough to stop him. He enters the room against her will. The Prophet begins to embrace and caress him, and this extraordinary conversation begins between the Prophet and the celestial visitor. Do you love him? Asks the angel or the visitor, and the Prophet replies, yes, of course I love him. In some texts, I love him more than life itself. And the answer he receives from the angelic visitor is, your own community will kill him. But if you wish, I will show you the place in which he will be killed, to which the Prophet answers yes. The narrator then continues that the visitor seizes across time and space a handful of dust or soil from this place in which Hussein would fall and brings to him this soil or this red earth. The Prophet then gives this to Salama, who guards it for the years between that moment and the death of al-Hussein at Karbalā಼. This is one of the texts that's taken curiously from Ibn ʿAsākir. His chain of transmission is of interest because he's quite a rigorous scholar. The train of transmission includes a number of people who are known in the Islamic world. I just want to see if I can get this PowerPoint to work properly. A number of people who are known in the Islamic world. I might just start it again if you don't mind. So obviously Anas bin Malik is well enough known, and he is at the start of this chain. After him comes his stellar pupil, Thabit al-Bunani, who is the great promoter of the strands that come from Anas. Ibn Abi Shayba is the producer of a Kufan who produces a Musannaf, one of these theological works of hadith that is arranged according to topics. And then finally in the chain comes Ibn ʿAsākir himself, who is well known for his anti-Shia stance. This is a man who has little time for either the Christians or the Shia and works as a propagandist, not only as an historian, against them, making this particular set of texts in his work quite curious for the reader. We will come back to the question of Ibn ʿAsākir. So this book, Angels Hastening, forms very loosely a third, if you like, of what could be called a trilogy. All three of these books that I have attempted are in fact attempts to recount some of the foundational stories and myths of Shi'i Islam, or maybe not so much Shi'i Islam as that early tendency, that tashayyu, that centered around Kufa and around the partisans of Ali bin Abi Talib. I use the word myth in the same way that I would use the word myth to describe some of the determinative stories of the Judeo-Christian tradition. In itself, myth is not an adverse thing. Myth generally is constructed around an element of historical or at least perceived truth. And the meanings or the interpretations of myths tend to be modified from generation to generation because every generation reinterprets itself and its own past in terms of its own current values. And this is particularly true, I think, of Shi'i Islam. I'm not writing primarily for Shi'i Muslims who don't need a Catholic clergyman to explain to them the early history of Shi'i Islam. I'm writing really for people in the West who don't have access to the Arabic texts and who have never heard these foundational stories, although they may have seen elements of these stories, such as the Karbalāʼ processions or the Arba'in procession, acted out and not known their background. For those who are specialists, I have provided in the text substantial footnotes of all the sources that I've used, but without allowing the extreme difficulty of the source problem to overshadow the genre of the texts I've looked at and the content of the narratives. So the book deals with a series of predictive dreams or visions. Throughout these texts, both the Shi'i and the Sunni texts, the dream or the vision is expressed by these three discrete Quranic terms. Either ru'ya, which is the normal term for a vision, sometimes manam. Now, manam can easily mean sleep in Arabic, but sometimes it is used to mean a dream while asleep, as opposed to a waking vision. And then the word hulm with its plural ahlam. or sometimes hulum, but usually ahlam. And hulm, more often than not, refers to a dream that brings bad news. In fact, the Prophet, in a variety of hadith, suggests that these dreams come from shaitan. The content of the dreams that I've dealt with, either waking dreams or visions or dreams while asleep, is a prediction of the murder of al-Ḥusayn bin Ali by the community of Muhammad on the field of Karbalāʼ, an event which would take place long after the death of the Prophet. They begin, these dreams, before the birth or even conception of al-Ḥusayn, and they continue steadily until the night of his death. The last word is given to the ģinn, who are heard by Salama lamenting on the night air in what may have been a vision that she herself had. These dreams then transform from predictive dreams into extrapolative dreams, if you like, dreams that predict the fate of any single person who was even remotely connected with the murder of al-Ḥusayn. The subjects of the dream vary. Quite often it is Muhammad himself who dreams, or Ali bin Abi Talib, or Lady Fatima, or her son al-Ḥusayn, or his daughter Sukaina. So there you have core members of the Ahl Bayt and their offspring. But there are other women who dream, particularly two women associated with the household of the Prophet, and that is Ayman and al-Fadl. Two other women who dream are associated not with the Prophet's household, but with the Prophet's enemies. That is Hind, mother of Muawiyah, and Hind, wife of Yazid bin Muawiyah. And a variety of soldiers and guards and camp followers in the army of Yazid also dream, as does Ibn Abbas, the famous transmitter of hadith, and one rather hapless passing Byzantine diplomat who ends up in the court of Yazid at a very bad moment. But at the heart of the book, at the heart of almost all of these texts, stands this intriguing figure of Salama, widow of the Prophet, who acts as a surrogate grandmother to young al-Hasan and al-Ḥusayn, and I suppose it could be said whose ostensible failure to guard the door and actually prevent the young al-Ḥusayn from entering a secret meeting between his grandfather and some mysterious visitor is really the moment of dramatic irony around which much of the story is going to weave itself. The dominant personalities contained within the dream are sometimes Muhammad himself, but almost always an angel, chiefly named as Jibreel, but named in other ways at other times for a very particular reason, and we will come back to that. Jibreel, however we want to describe this celestial being, is presumed to be angelic in function. In fact, the Quran never says that Jibreel is an angel, never gives Jibreel that designation, and there is a hint that this Jibreel has a status and a function, maybe a genus and a species that is somewhat different from the rest of the angelic hierarchy. So it might be appropriate to put at the very start of this investigation three inescapable problems that we deal with as soon as we attempt to write about early Islamic history. The first problem, of course, is the problem of sources. Any attempt to delve into these constitutive stories of early Islam, whether Sunni or Shia, lands us in front of this terrible impasse that was so well articulated by Harold Motzki. This impasse as he underscores the infeasibility of writing an historical biography without being accused of not using the sources critically. Or on the other side, the infeasibility or impossibility of constructing such a biography when the sources are critically used. Now, I am more aware of the extraordinary amount of work done in this crucial issue of Islamic historical and biographical sources. I'm aware, for example, as are all of our students in this institute in Rome, of the pioneering work done by whole generations of scholars, starting with Gustav Weil, and scholars even today, like our own moderator of this program, studies into the source problems and the source criticism of early Islamic historical and biographical studies. Source criticism has become of necessity a field of expertise now in Islamic studies. I am interested that there are a number of differing opinions in this rather difficult field, Muslim and non-Muslim, who propose different routes. The route, for example, that is proposed by Halaq, who suggests the route really of probability rather than certainty, but also Nabia Abbott, Sezgin, Fazlur Rahman, and Harold Motzke himself. Halaq himself admitted that even the Islamic jurists will tell you that probability does allow for a certain amount of fabrication and error. It doesn't solve our problem, the impasse that we face in trying to write a work, but it gives us a route we could follow. So in order to present to a wider audience, a non-Muslim audience especially, some of the elemental stories of Islam, and taking my lead from the form criticism that is so prominent in Christian and especially Christian scholarship, I've attempted to read these texts according to the didactic genre, the genre that teaches something, in parallel with some of the texts of the Judeo-Christian tradition, such as the hagiographical texts of early Christian scholarship, trying to discover new elements or elements of these early kind of raw materials which influenced the beginnings of the community and to which the redactors would finally give a more definitive form. It is here that I find personally most strongly the ritual and the passion and the drama, which is the paradoxical base narrative really of Shi'i Islam. Dabashi, the author, notes quite cryptically, it is only in power when it is not in power, because with this increasing realization that its rightful earthly authority had been usurped, Shia piety turns increasingly to an esoteric spiritual authority. And all of these developing dream stories are colored by this single enigma, the shadow, or perhaps the blazing light of the Karbalā಼ event. But the source problem is not unique to Islam. Judaism and Christianity both make claims about formative texts with divine origins. And these texts are hugely problematic. We have to read them discerningly and critically. And I have followed very closely in all three works that I've written the advice of Mahmoud Ayub, who asks what the criterion is that we should use in writing religious history, in examining these traditions which claim to tell events of great importance for the religious life of countless people. We can't, he says, limit ourselves just to the bare facts as we see them, because even those can be arbitrary. And we can't take all the traditions as factual data. So we have to choose facts, including facts which seem not historically valid, but were considered such by the community. This, for me, is a helpful way to unlock some of the problematic texts. One of them in Shi'i studies is the famous book of Sulaym bin Qais, which so many people have studied and written about. How to unlock a text which quite clearly expresses a very, very primitive Shia way of thinking. So that's the first dilemma that faces us, the dilemma of sources, and it's not going to go away. Second dilemma is the dilemma of history, because in any attempt to write early Islamic history or biography, in all the great monotheistic traditions, we are faced with the same problem, that religious and secular history seem to be inextricably bound. They seem to run along parallel lines without any problem at all. For the secular historian, there may not be any such thing as objective sacred history. It's got no obvious significance for secular history, religious history, or sacred history, except insofar as secular history may be affected by the way that a particular religious group or a particular religious movement impacts upon it and modifies its course. But for the monotheist believer, and as well as believers of other religions, sacred and secular history journey together. The sacred is understood quite frequently as interventions of the divine revelatory voice into a world, a collection, if you like, of divine responses, so perceived, to earthly events. So mainstream monotheists regard particular religious events as historical occurrences, backed up at the very least by eyewitness accounts, or maybe just by stark symbols, like empty tombs, or the conferral of the Sinai covenant, or the Last Supper, or the birth of Imam Ali in the Kaaba, so that in a sense we're bound to read these texts, not just purely academically, but also in some sense with the understanding of the religious reader, the text that forges and informs and persuades faith. And I have, in some sense, even as a non-Muslim, attempted to read these texts in this way. It's not dissimilar to the work of two very important German Protestant theologians, Pannenberg and to some extent Kuhlmann. Pannenberg argued this point, that the essence of theology is history, that we need to think, he said, of the whole of history as revelatory or as revelation, that there is no real difference between what he called ordinary events and miraculous events. In this, he went against what people like Rudolf Bultmann were saying about the difference between historic and historical. And following Schleiermacher and Bonhoeffer, he insisted that the divine works through the ordinary, that we have to have faith to appreciate this, but that history, in a sense, doesn't make any sense without someone to appreciate it. It would be meaningless if nobody appreciated it, like a work of art, he would say. Doesn't matter how great a work of art is. It's nothing without people to appreciate it. And at the same time, it makes sense to evaluate works of art, to describe some as especially great. In the same way, says Pannenberg, we need to reflect on history and see the divine work there, but also understand that certain events in history are especially revelatory as compared to others, that historical events are not like a mathematical theorem, but they are various degrees of probability. Now, this is the opinion of one or two German theologians who are highly regarded, but it does impact upon this problem of how to read Islamic history in which the sacred and the secular are inseparable. Maybe this is one of the subtexts of this work, that we should not be surprised to find serious historians, especially the Sunni historians like Ibn Kathir, Ibn ʿAsākir, portraying angelic visions, for example, and predictive dreams with the very same earnestness with which they portray battles or lives or deaths as eyewitness history. And then one final issue that faced me particularly is the problem of the sources themselves. In this book, as in the other two books, although the subject matter is primarily the primal stories and myths of that early Islamic tendency, which we call tashayyu, the first stirrings maybe of a mystical movement or the first stirrings of a political discontent, I have attempted always to use a fine balance of Sunni and Shia sources. And all of the sources that I've used are well known and well worked by scholars. I think here particularly of this controversial Kitab Sulaym bin Qais, one of the texts I did use, although fully cognizant of the critical scholarship that has developed around it. It does remind one as a text, Kitab Sulaim, that Shia Islam has far fewer historians than does Sunni Islam, but Shia Islam has perhaps far more who engage in professional apologetical discourse. So I've used both Sunni and Shia sources, firstly, in an attempt to counter any suggestion that these dream narratives are driven by nothing more than an ongoing Shia attempt, apologetically driven, to give some sort of, I don't know, divine approval or angelic endorsement to the Husseinian revolution and the drama of his martyrdom. In fact, there are numerous elements of the whole Karbala story and the dreams around Karbala that are found quite distinctly outside of the corpus of Shia hadith, outside of Shia history, but in major Sunni sources as well. And angelic messages are not necessarily a later interpolation by some apologetic author. The second 8th century Sunni Ibn Tahman is one of a handful of very early Sunni scholars already alluding to these dreams about Karbala, even before someone like Tirmiḍī begins to write of them. So even if, as we noted at the start, we choose to follow a substantial number of academics who would regard large parts of the hadith as unreliable as sources, we still have to deal with these stories in basic narrative form in many of the important Islamic historians, most of whom are Sunni, and many of whom admittedly do actually fill their texts with hadith. So that at the very least, these reports could be regarded as more than just a Shia reading of history or an attempt by the Shia at divine endorsement. But I've also tried to use Sunni and Shia texts for another reason, and that is because there seem to me to be archetypal elements in these narratives that resonate in the texts of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, not just divine texts, but also secondary texts, such as the hagiography of Christianity, perhaps some of the writings of Judaism as well. Just a glance, for example, at the trilogy by Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, The Masks of God, Oriental Mythology, tells us this immediately, that these elements are present far outside of the monotheistic tradition. The elements of the story, as it's told, the dreams predicting Karbala and the death at the hands of Muslims of al-Ḥusayn, the Prophet's grandson, the elements are primitive to begin with, but they are refined as the texts succeed each other, as each transmitter gives an increasing theological significance, starting with Sulaim bin Qais, or if we reject him and push him to one side, Ibn Tahman, mid-2nd, 8th century, and fragments that we have in Abu Mikhnaf, who is a contemporary of Ibn Tahman. Now, we have to note too that Abu Mikhnaf is problematic, equivocal, because we've lost the primary text, of course, so we've got fragments of Abu Mikhnaf in other compilations, although his work on Karbala is of crucial importance. Supposedly, he was a companion of Ja'far as-Sadiq, and was probably what we would call a Shia at a time when Ja'far as-Sadiq and his associates were beginning to develop al-Baqir's initial formulations into something more systematic, a more systematic and determined conception, for example, of imama. Nonetheless, the historical reports of Abu Mikhnaf, despite this association, are quite patently accepted by the Sunni as well, even though he is patently sympathetic towards the Kufa and the Shia elements. Certainly some of his writings survive. Some of them ascribed to him appear not to be his at all, but are pseudographs, quite freely written and quite a deviation from his original work over the course of time. But as a number of scholars like Wustenfeld have said, they do contain core elements, and in places unchanged text from the fragments we have, and therefore always worth using. So while this book is not particularly a work of comparative theology. There are 5 elements that, or 3 or 4 elements that greatly interested me. And I wanted to look at them a little. They interest me because they have a distinct resonance in other texts of other traditions. So I thought, although it sounds banal, I thought I would start with the issue of dust. Generally in these texts, it is either turab or turba, but sometimes sihla, which is maybe a slightly more coarse form of soil. And of course, in the Hebrew text, this word is expressed in the book of Genesis as afar. It has a multivariate meaning, the word dust, in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. You could justifiably understand when in a cloud or a storm that dust is seen as divine punishment on a people, while the common gesture is well known not only in the Hebrew Christian but also in the Islamic tradition of casting dust on the head or sitting in dust as a sign of extreme grief or mourning, or perhaps lamentation and affliction. In the Karbalāʼ texts, it is the Prophet Muhammad who begins the story with dust on his beard and on his head. Dust denotes the grave. It resonates again in that instance, if you like, with the dust of Karbalāʼ, which Jibreel describes as the place where the bodies of the martyrs will lie. And throwing dust at people or shaking dust off is to renounce all future relations. It's a sign of abhorrence. These are all very interesting features, but in essence, it is a symbol of human frailty, a symbol of human mortality and loneliness. It's the element from which we supposedly come and to which we will return. Now, I think the most primary and the most evocative meaning for dust is found in the creation accounts, the 2 accounts in Genesis, because quite clearly the animals were not formed from the dust. They were formed from the Adama, just the ground. It is humans who were formed from the Afar, the dust, so that it seems to me that it is not merely the divine breath, the ruh, or the neshama that sets humans apart from animals, but also the substance from which they were created that renders them somewhat different. So that dust, in an almost antithetical way here, becomes a life-giving symbol, linked to the dust of Karbalāʼ, because the place where Hussein dies becomes a life-giving symbol for those who come after him. The dust in these stories that I've looked at begins as nothing more than a tiny smudge on the head or the beard of Muhammad, seen in a variety of dreams after his death, dreams of Ibn Abbas and dreams of Salama. That dust eventually is going to become dust that Muhammad holds in his hand in further dreams, turning it over and over again as he mourns over the death of his grandson. Then it's going to be given a shape and a texture and a color and an odor. It becomes a clod of earth or mud, or in Ibn Hanbal, vibrantly red-colored dust. Intriguingly, the Hebrew name for Adam, so well known to us, is precisely from the word Adama, meaning earth. But more precisely, the word Adama, from which Adam is formed, is red earth, so that the name Adam means son of earth that is red. Ultimately, this dust is going to be given to the guardianship of Salama. She will keep it in her glass vial. This hadith al-Qarura tells the story, the hadith of the glass vial, and she will stand guard over it for the next 40 years or more until the day of Karbalāʼ, when that dust will turn to fresh blood, as is predicted by Muhammad and by Jibreel before him. And it is the moment of this transformation of dust into blood that marks the death of al-Ḥusayn. And yet once again, the dust in the vial takes on a life-giving principle, the principle of blood, and enigmatically, the renewed life that is going to be drawn by countless believers from the Karbalā಼ event. So dust plays a significant role, an archetypal role through all of these dreams, and it is given an increasing theological importance and meaning, but also an increasingly different shape and texture and color and odor. A second archetypal theme that runs through all of this is this conversation that the prophet has, I simply say, with angels. I mean really with the celestial being, whoever it is, who stands before him in these dreams. The trouble is, the celestial being is hard to pinpoint. The conversation between Muhammad and this being grows increasingly bold. And it becomes somewhat reminiscent of the figure of Abraham in Jewish and Islamic sources, who also engages in an increasingly undaunted conversation with God. Abraham also is going to be visited by divine messengers. They're going to bring to him, as they did to Muhammad, a mix of news that is both good and bad. And having brought him this news, Abraham's conversations with the divine becomes more and more bold. I believe, he says in Surah al-Baqarah, I believe, but I want more confidence for my heart. In this, he echoes the challenge of Abraham before God. How do I know this is going to happen? In fact, in Genesis, Abraham twice mildly challenges God, and then in his intercession for the people of Lot is persistent and confident. The conversation between Muhammad and this angel changes. He begins as nothing more than a silent recipient of very, very bad news. And then intermittently, he begins to take the lead in the conversation. He, in early accounts, stays silent. Then he begins to express simply a wish to know the identity of the killers of his grandson. And eventually, before even being asked by the angel, would you like to see, he wants to be shown the place or the dust of the place where al-Ḥusayn will be killed. The conversation as it develops is very important for the reader, because as with the conversation between Abraham and God, we become slowly but inexorably aware of the fate of the people of Lot. So too, as we read these stories, we become increasingly aware of a place called Karbalāʼ, which at first is very hesitantly described by its physical elements, most frequently through its dust or its soil where Hussein will fall. Eventually, it is going to be pinpointed not only as a place from which this angel will retrieve dust, but a place that is named for its distress and tribulation, Karb wa Balā. A third element is a problematic element, of course, in Islamic studies, and that is that the angel is giving increased anthropomorphic elements as the text goes on. And the anthropomorphic elements ascribed to this heavenly messenger appear to me to be given deliberately in order to increase the urgency of the message. I suppose they could justifiably be read in the light of the famous hadith in which the prophet claims that Jibreel used to come and compare the Quran with him every year, once, but that this year, the year in which he is speaking, he has come twice, so that the prophet says, speaking here to Aisha, I cannot but see that the time of my death is close. This is a well-known hadith carried by everyone from Ibn Sa'd through Muslim, Khawarizmi, up until Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and others. It's a very important hadith for the Shia community because it has to be read in the context of and together with a famous surah and verse from the Quran, and that's Surah al-Ma'idah, verse 67, messenger, deliver what has been sent down to you from your Lord, and if you do not, then you have not conveyed his message. The sense of this gives context to the urgency of Jibreel in the book that I have researched. Why? Well, because if, according to the Shia, the Quran is fully existent at the time of the Prophet's death, the Quran that Jibreel compares with him or examines with him, then one has to ask, well, what is it that Muhammad still has to deliver in order to make known his message? The Shia refer this key text to Ghadir Khum and the announcement of Ali's successorship. Were Muhammad to convey the Quranic message in Shia theology without also appointing someone particular to interpret it and guard it, it would be as though the message had not been conveyed. There is a similar urgency in the angel who visits Muhammad with the Karbalāʼ dreams. And it seems to me that this animation, these anthropomorphic elements are there not just to increase his character for the reader, but also the words and the motions are used to increase the urgency. It's quite clear that Jibreel takes a singular role in these stories, but he performs distinct gestures to retrieve dust from Karbala. He beats the ground with his fist or with his wing, or he reaches his hand or his wing across time and space into Karbala to seize its dust, or he expands his wing, and there is this hurried movement of the angel between heaven and earth because his message is not being accepted. There is a series of hadith in which both Muhammad and Fatima reject the idea of a son or a grandson who will be killed. 3 times, Jibreel returns to heaven and comes down to earth. The verbs that are used by the Arabic text are quite intriguing. The verb intahadda has this, it's an 8-form verse. It has this strong sense of just quitting a place and rising and hastening away, perhaps even of spreading wings. The verb in araja is a sense of turning away and leaving and forsaking, but the most powerful verb of all is the 7th-form verb in qadda, which means to swoop down, to hurl down. And in all of these verbs used to describe the movement of Jibreel between heaven and earth, one gets the sense of an urgency to make sure that the message is made known and is accepted, in line with the hadith and the Quranic verse so important to Shia theology. There is, fourthly, a rather intriguing idea of land that cannot be entered, the idea of God through an angel pointing out to someone an unenterable land, a place that is named, described, envisioned, and pointed out, but that cannot be entered or will only be entered by a succeeding generation. The land of Karbalāʼ is pointed out to Muhammad in these dreams or described to him in these dreams. And the dramatic events that are going to unfold there are described to him in some gruesome detail. In this moment, it ties him to 2 Quranic prophetic figures, but who are also revered, obviously, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It ties him to Abraham. He's also shown a land which he will not enter, but that will become the possession at some future point of his descendants. There is some dispute in some of the Hebrew texts about whether Abraham actually did enter the land or not, but there are enough texts too to suggest that the land would be entered by somebody else. Moses also is shown all the land of promise, but he himself will not be able to go in. It will be Joshua, his successor, who will see the promise fulfilled. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5 of the Quran, in fact, it's not Moses, but his rebellious followers who will not enter this promised land. But the key issue for me is that these 3 prophetic characters, Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad, all of them see lands that are going to become foundational in the history of their own communities, even though they themselves may not enter that land. we could end by saying a word about this rather inexplicable character called Jibril, because of course angels are indispensable to Islamic belief, much more than they are to Judeo-Christian belief. In the Christian tradition, angels are not part of creedal statement. In Islam, they are second in the list of what Muslims must believe to be Muslim. In God, secondly in his angels. And their chief importance, of course, in Islamic faith is tied with their function in revelation, specifically Jibril. That's not their chief importance in the Judeo-Christian tradition, certainly not tied with public revelation. But it is the nature of the angel after which, the function of the angel, not his nature or its nature after which it is named. Angel is a function, not a nature. And this provides an interesting clue to trying to figure out who Jibril is. Jibril, named sometimes differently, Jibrail or Jibreel, is named only 3 times in the text of the Quran. But he dominates this book, Angels Hastening, as he dominates the texts of Hadith. He becomes there an angel, the supernatural being, the bringer of revelation, who is named as an angel. But it is only in the Hadith, not in the Quran, that he is called this angel. In the case of al-Ḥusayn, unlike the case of Maryam in Surat al-Imran, the announcement of his death, although in Maryam's case, the announcement of a birth, is not a group of angels. It is one single angel who is going to be clearly identified in all of these dream texts, predictive texts. He's either going to be called Jibril in the later texts, or in the earlier texts, he's simply going to be called the angel of the rain. And in texts like Tirmiḍī, he's going to be called an angel who has never descended before, in order to separate quite patently this angelic visitor from the angelic visitor who brings divine revelation, and to separate quite patently in texts like Tirmiḍī and Ibn Hanbal the idea that these predictive dreams have anything to do with divine revelation. But the angel of the rain, who becomes the angel never descended before, who becomes Jibril, is nonetheless a central feature in all of these stories. It is hard to get a composite picture of this being called Jibril, because the Sunni corpus of hadith provide a very inconsistent picture. We know that he is seen by Muhammad at least twice in his original form, at least according to Aisha, and that he has this massive bulk that's filling the space between heaven and earth. Curiously, in the Sunni hadith, whereas people like Aisha describe the mechanics of the first revelation, they omit any description of the one who brought the first revelation. At other times, Muhammad sees Jibril apparently as a man. In the Battle of the Trench, for example, in the year 6 of Hijrah, Jibril arrives on the battlefield as a soldier, brushing the dust from his hair. Other people don't see him, or at least other people are fooled into thinking they've seen him. Either a companion of Muhammad or a traveler dressed in sparkling white garments with pitch black hair who does not seem to be tired by his journey, or as a man dressed in white standing by the Prophet. Occasionally, the Prophet himself points out to his companions that was Jibril. Most of the Islamic commentators, the classical commentators, identify the spirit, the ruh of the Quranic text with Jibril, and Jibril with the one who descended with revelation. Though, of course, the text of the Quran doesn't actually insist on that identification. The Quran does not classify Jibril as a spirit or as an angel. The drawback with the word spirit is that it carries the weight of Christian pneumatology. If you don't capitalize the word, I suppose, it could easily and justifiably just refer to an angel. But a number of English translators have capitalized the word in the Quran, leading to some confusion amongst non-Muslim readers. Now, all of these elements that I've spoken about tonight, they may be of interest to a few specialists. But for me, the narratives are worth retelling, because at its deepest level, beyond all the details of the bloodied soil of Iraq and the air pulsating with angels' wings and the flurry of movement between the house of Salama and heaven, beyond all her ineffectual attempts to guard the door, beyond the proposition of a Husseinian revolution and a Husseinian indictment of iniquity, beyond the paradigm of defiant resistance against injustice, these stories of dreams detail the evolving manner in which a particular group of people understood what they perceived to be an encounter with the divine. And after all, the whole Islamic ethic roots itself in that the human relationship with God is the most elemental of all relationships. The dream of Salama on the night of Karbalāঃ, of a long dead Muhammad weeping over his grandson's death, a dream that tore her from her sleep just in time to hear voices on the air, the ģinn lamenting, was one of a series of auguries of both pre and post Karbalāঃ predictions, which now forms an inextinguishable echo that resonates through all the texts of medieval Sunni and Shia Islam. In a religious tradition which so easily embraces secular and sacred history together, and angelic visitations and predictive dreams and somber visions as part of eyewitness history, this book becomes, for me, an important glimpse for non-Muslims and non-specialists into some of the texts that drive the passion of Shia Islam. So I've attempted a little foray, if you like, into those classical and medieval texts which attempt to trace a particular prognostic vision, starting before al-Husayn's birth and ending after the punishment of his killers, in dreams that are filled with the dust of Iraq, the blood of the martyrs, and by angels hastening. I've set out to tell part of the Karbalāঃ story that is very rarely related outside of traditional majlis or ta'ziyah settings, opening to a wider, more diverse audience, the elements of a battle that has left an ineffaceable mark in the Islamic world, perpetually engraved upon the memories of those devoted to Islam. Thank you for listening to this lecture, this talk, and thank you for honoring this College of PISAI in Rome with your presence.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for this talk, which was fascinating. And I really admire you that you tackle, I mean, these, despite all the methodological issues, these early texts and these early foundational texts, which is certainly a difficult thing to do. So I suggest that we now open the discussion. As I said, you can either put your questions or comments in the chat and I'll read them out. On the other hand, we are not that many people, so we could also try that you raise your hand electronically, and then I pass the word to you. Andreas Görke.
Yeah, hi, and thank you for this very interesting and engaging presentation. I've got two questions with regard to the sources. Firstly, you mentioned the first hadith you quoted from Ibn ʿAsākir, and you mentioned that it had Ibn Abi Shayba in the isnad. And I wondered whether the hadith features in Ibn Abi Shayba's Musannaf, or whether we can find that hadith earlier than Ibn ʿAsākir. And the second question is you frequently spoke of early accounts and how the accounts developed. And I wondered how you assessed whether a hadith is early. So do you rely on the very likely development of the dogma, for instance, with regard to the angels, or do the isnads provide evidence of how the hadith developed as well? So can we see who is responsible for any changes in these hadith?
Thank you. So that hadith from Ibn ʿAsākir is traced back to Anas bin Malik, and almost certainly it is in Ibn Abi Shayba as well. But I decided to begin with Ibn ʿAsākir because I was looking for a solid historian who is not a Shia and not particularly pro-Shia, to see what elements of this story he was willing to include in his history. And in fact, Ibn ʿAsākir recounts this hadith, I think 4 or 5 times, with slightly different chains of transmission and slightly different elements. Now, I've followed, as I did in all my books, a very simple route, and that is I've attempted to start with the earliest texts that we can find in Shia Islam, putting aside Kitab Sulaym. Firstly, because Kitab Sulaym doesn't have this hadith. His hadith seem to concentrate on the Saqifa event more than the Karbalāʼ, or the idea of what would happen at Karbalāʼ. So putting aside him, and also putting aside perhaps Abu Mikhnaf, who is problematic, I have gone to the 6 books, certainly of Sunni Islam, and then to the earliest Islamic Shia texts leading up to the 4 books and then beyond them, because this is the easiest route to take, to look at and I haven't looked always at the isnad as closely as I have at the narrative, because it's the genre of the narrative and the development of the elements that interest me. So for example, at a particular moment, the angel is going to be named as the angel of revelation. But in the earlier texts like Tirmiḍī and Hanbal and even Ibn Tahman, he's not named as the angel of revelation, a definite attempt to separate. So to find out, it's somewhat difficult to find out who exactly gave the name to the angel. Almost certainly it's one of the Shia authors, not one of the Sunni authors. But I've taken an easy route because isnad studies and source studies are not my specialty. I've relied on a kind of a gut feeling that starting with the earliest, using the idea of tracing one text that transmits to the next, both in a Sunni and a Shia line, I could find at least some of the elements that develop. But it is an impossible problem, source problem.
Well, I wouldn't say it's impossible. So you would basically go for the source where you find the hadith and date it accordingly.
According to the source, yeah.
Yeah, because of course, later sources may contain earlier material. And so there is the danger of having a preconceived idea of how the development must have happened, which then informs the dating of that.
Look, the later sources in Shia Islam are problematic because they're almost all of them, the very late ones, encyclopedic, simply collections of hadith without any definition of what sort of quality the hadith is. So although they are useful, I really do try to go back to the earliest sources to which I myself have access. I also, again, as I said at the beginning, I don't want the narrative to be overshadowed by this problem, because the narrative is for people who might be interested in reading early Islamic history that they haven't read before. But I've given within the footnotes the lists of sources in the order that I've used them and according to the school of Islam that I've used them. It's always a fascination for me, to find in people like Ibn ʿAsākir especially, texts which seem to sway in favor of the Husseinian movement and against some of the rulers of Islam at that time. And yet he is, I think, a Shafi scholar and a fierce anti-Shia propagandist. One finds it hard to understand why he would include these texts, whereas other authors have omitted texts, any texts that give prominence, for example, to the Alid movement.
Thank you.
Sabine, you're muted.
Joanne Scarlett, please. Sorry.
Just a quick suggestion based on what you were just talking about. You might take a look at attitudes towards Yazid in your Sunni authors. And part of the saying, the Battle of Karbalāʼ shouldn't have happened and, this was horrible and whatever, is part of the critique of Yazid, which you actually see a fair bit. So from Sunni authors. So anyway, just quickly, I wanted to say something about the angel of rain. What I find interesting about that is that seasonally, in this part of the world that we're talking about, you have what is referred to as red rain. It comes at the season when you're at the end of the dry season, as the first rains of fall come. And it's literally red in color from the dirt that's in the air, red rain. But what it also symbolizes at some level is the bringing of life, imbuing with life the soil which has in the meantime been completely, absolutely dead. So this idea of turning the dust into blood fits beautifully with calling him the angel of the rain, just as an image from this part of the world.
So if I could add two things to that, because it is a very interesting idea. There are plenty of Shi'i hadith, early Shi'i hadith, which talk about these cataclysmic events that happen, apocalyptic events that happen immediately after the death of Hussein, and a rain of blood for 3 days is one of them. Now, Ibn Kathir hates this idea, and he says the Shia, as usual, are exaggerating all this nonsense about the sky being darkened and the stones. Every stone is filled with blood and this rain of blood. But the other interesting thing for me about the angel of the rain is the genre or the theme of thirst at Karbalāঃ. It's a massively important theme that it was the lack of access to water in a dry place that brought about the fall of the Husseinian group. And so again, you have this link between the idea of the angel of rain being the one who announces the death of one who is going to be starved of water. And of course, after the death of Hussein, the dreams turn to punishment. And a number of those dreams include having to drink things that are not water, like pitch and tar, as a punishment for that thirst-inducing threat. So the angel of rain is fascinating and is not Jibreel. I consulted a number of Islamic scholars about who is the angel of rain. It's definitely not Jibreel.
Yeah. But of course, the other thing that you might keep in mind is it's possible that the 3 days of red rain is actually historically accurate. Absolutely. If the battle was at the right time of year, and it goes with the thirst, then they will have had potentially red rain if it was exactly at the right point in time. So that's interesting. It kind of marks the date if you're interested in the season, because we can't tell now with the calendar, it goes round and round and round. But the original battle was fought in the fall, and at that point, just as the rains were about to come. Yeah. So
if I could also bring up Yazid one more time, because I've been I've been quite severely attacked by my Shia friends about my attitude to Yazid, because I think myself that Yazid was fully conscious of what he'd done, and he understood that he'd made a terrible mistake. The texts which recount the conversations between Zainab and Yazid, and more particularly Zain al-Abidin and Yazid, show quite clearly a man who is backtracking fast and who showers favors upon the prisoners, and says to Ali bin al-Hussein, anything you want, I will give you. It seems to me, despite the fact that he is loathed in the Shi'i world for good reason, it seems to me that of the two leaders, Ibn Ziyad and Yazid, that he is the one who understands the gravity of what he's done. The Sunni text, a number of Sunni texts, make him out to be a gambler. Apparently, he liked dog racing. Dog racing was one of his passions, as well as various other things. But I'm fascinated because Yazid takes on, from a Christian perspective, a Pontius Pilate aspect of washing his hands, refusing to listen to his wife's dream predictions, turning his face to the wall, a bit like David in the Jewish scriptures. And it seems to me that he grasps the gravity, whereas Ibn Ziyad does not grasp the gravity. Yazid could be excused because of his distance from the battlefield, but in the end, he plays a fundamental role in the death of al-Hussein. But his character, for a psychologist, would, I think, be of great interest.
Yes. Good luck on that one.
Thank you. If I may ask one question, coming back to something Andreas Görke had said, and you reply to it. I wouldn't discard completely the later compilations of hadith that have been produced mostly during the Safavid period or beginning from the Safavid period, because these people like Al-Afandi, Majlisi, etc., they were very, very source critical, and they really, I mean, scanned through whatever they could get their holds on to find as early sources as possible. And as you can see in Bihar al-Anwar, I mean, he's very careful always stating his source, and these kind of things are absolutely reliable. So I would not discard this material completely. I think it can tell us a lot. I have another question, because it always makes me a bit uneasy when, and I could sense this sometimes when people talk about what is Shi'i, what is Sunni, what is typically Shi'i, what is typically Sunni. I mean, this kind of essentialist approach to the different groups. I mean, so my question is really, to what extent, on the one hand, are you selective with your material by looking at certain topoi rather than others? And to what extent also, secondly, you are looking at the later interpretation of the material you are looking at? And this, I mean, the background being that we have in Shia studies nowadays, we have two large tendencies. I mean, we have the tendency of Henri Corbin and his followers saying that Shiism is a very esoteric movement from the very beginning and continues to be so. And we have another tendency that says, well, there is this esoteric element, but it's marginal. And for the most part, Shiism is the most rational trend in Islam that you can find. So where would you situate yourself with your research in this larger discussion in Shia studies?
Well, thank you. This was an issue that came up in the first work, which was my PhD work on Fatima, in the sense, firstly, that you can't really, I think, talk about Shia Islam until around, I would think, the time of Jafar as-Sadiq, who begins to formulate the essentials of Shi'i doctrine, of, let's say, Ithna Ashari doctrine. Until then, it is this tendency or this partisanship around Ali, but in the same way that there's a point where you can begin to talk about Sunni Islam, but not for the first few centuries. You can't really begin to give that name to either or. The problem with later interpretations is that they become increasingly hagiographical. The interpretations of Karbalāʼ, Hussein, the early Ahlul Bayt, they become increasingly hagiographical in their interpretations, which is why people like, I think, Ali in Iran stepped in, his name has slipped me, who stepped in and introduced this idea of red Shiism, black Shiism, that there has to be a more rational Shiism that takes on political issues and deals with them rather than buries itself in a more esoteric weeping and mourning and sadness. So that idea for me is quite important. You know, as a Catholic, I come from a similar tradition where there is a balance between esoteric hagiography and a more rational approach to theology. So I do understand it, but Karbalāʼ is less difficult to work with. People like Fatima is exceptionally difficult to work with because your earliest texts are quite primitive, like Kitab Sulaym. Your later texts are very definitely partisan, and your even later texts are hagiography in their interpretation, as this woman becomes more and more the queen of heaven and less a human figure. So I've had to kind of leap into this and attempt to find a balance. It's one of the reasons why I try to use Shia and Sunni sources in the hope to get a balance. But the honest answer to the question is that I sort of follow a gut feeling. I look at the texts which are well known in Shia Islam rather than obscure ones to begin with, and historians who are well known in Sunni Islam, because one has to begin with some sort of basis. And picking up the elements from then, I then attempt to trace those elements like soil or angelic visitation or dream or Salama back to as many texts as I can find. But I'm working blind because, of course, source criticism is not my field. Narrative history and genre is what I'm kind of functioning in. So I rely on the expertise of others around me to guide me. But I would say that, I understand that real Shia, as we know it, 12 Shia, is really beginning around the time that Jafar as-Sadiq is creating a more definitive theology from the writings of Baqir.
Yes, thank you. We have some comments. We have a comment from Sana Nakwi. I'm a Shia Muslim. Thank you for bringing to light the event of Karbalāঃ. There is much to learn from it, and it belongs to it belongs and is open to all of humanity, just as Islam is. And then the same person, Sana Nakwi, says that you probably were referring to Ali Shariati, but that's just a guess. So I don't know.
Sorry.
What this is what you wanted to say. Okay, are there any other comments or questions at this point? If not, I will turn over to George.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christopher, for this fascinating talk, and for everybody who shared in the discussion. I have one foot at Gorgias Press as the editor-in-chief of the press, and the other foot at the Institute for Advanced Study as a senior research associate there. So it is always a pleasure to be part of both worlds. And I would like to thank Sabine again for co-hosting this with us, and Maria for everything that she's done for organizing this, and at the Gorgias, and Gemma, who is putting together this series. And Gemma maybe can tell us now a bit about the next talk, or any other information we need to know about this.
Hello. Oh, sorry, video. I'm here. Yes, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Christopher for the talk, and thanks to the IAS and Sabina, Maria, and of course George. So our Author's Voice series, this is the second year. First of all, let me just tell you about how you can get hold of Christopher's books, because I'm sure that many of you, having heard this wonderful talk, will be interested. I'll put everything in the chat with all the links, because we are happy to offer 30% off all of Christopher's books to those who joined the lecture today. So you just need coupon code ANGELS, which is in the chat when you order from our website. And as for the next lecture in the series, that's taking place in June, a very different theme, but equally fascinating. So the title of the next lecture is The Symbolic Language of Ethiopian Crosses, Explorations through Form and Ritual by Maria Evangelatou. And this book was part of a recent review in the New York Review of Books, so it's had a lot of high praise. It's going to be a fascinating lecture. And Maria is a professor of Mediterranean Studies at the Department of History and Art and Visual Culture at the University of California. So I will also put the link for the next lecture in the chat for anyone who might be interested. So thank you for everyone coming today. Thank you to Christopher again. That was a fascinating lecture, and we hope to see you all next time. And I'll hand back to Sabine maybe for a final word.
Well, thank you very much, Gemma and George, and thank you very much again, Christopher, for this fascinating talk. It was really very, very interesting, and I hope you continue this line of research so that we see more books from you coming in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.